Somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 people you pass on the street have eyes that scientists still cannot reliably explain. Not eyes that are difficult to describe, eyes that resist categorization at the genetic level, eyes that shift color depending on the light hitting them, the clothes surrounding them, sometimes even, according to some researchers, subtle changes in mood. We're talking about hazel eyes, and here's the detail that should stop you before we go any further. Geneticists can now predict whether a baby will have brown or blue eyes from a DNA sample with roughly 90 to 95% accuracy. For hazel eyes, using the exact same technology, that number collapses to somewhere between 50 and 80%, depending on the study and the population being tested. In an era when scientists can trace a person's ancestry back thousands of years from a fragment of bone, one of the most common eye colors on the planet still partially defies genetic prediction. That's not a minor gap in the data. That's a signal that something more complicated is happening inside that iris than a simple genetic switch. And the story gets stranger from there because hazel eyes aren't evenly distributed around the world. Globally, they show up in roughly 5 to 8% of the population, depending on how researchers draw the line between hazel and closely related shades like light brown or green. But travel to the Iberian Peninsula, the landmass shared by Spain and Portugal, and that number climbs dramatically. Multiple population studies have found that in some Iberian cohorts, hazel and hazel green eyes together account for well over half of all participants tested. That kind of concentration doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of history, specifically thousands of years of human migration converging on one narrow strip of land at the western edge of Europe. To understand why, you have to go back to the very beginning of eye color itself, and to a genetic story that took scientists decades to piece together. Start with the basics, because they're less simple than most people assume. Every human eye color ultimately comes down to how much of two pigments, eumelanin and pheomelanin, gets deposited into the iris, and how that pigment is arranged. Eumelanin is dark and dominant, the same pigment responsible for dark hair and skin. Pheomelanin is lighter, warmer, more reddish or yellow in tone. High concentrations of eumelanin absorb most incoming light and produce brown eyes. Very low concentrations mean light passes through and scatters instead of being absorbed, the same physical process that makes the sky look blue, called Rayleigh scattering, and the eye reads as blue. Hazel eyes sit precisely between those two extremes, not close to one end or the other, but genuinely intermediate, which turns out to be exactly why they're so hard to pin down genetically. The two genes doing the majority of the work here are OCA2 and HERC2, sitting next to each other on chromosome 15. For years, textbooks oversimplified eye color into a single dominant recessive pair, brown beats blue, end of story. That model has been thoroughly overturned. HERC2 doesn't produce pigment directly. It functions as a genetic switch, a regulatory region that controls how active the neighboring OCA2 gene is allowed to be. One specific variant inside HERC2, a single nucleotide change identified in research as R1113832, has repeatedly come out as the single strongest predictor of eye color in European populations, capable on its own of distinguishing blue from brown with striking reliability. But OCA2 and HERC2 are only the headline act. Genes including SLC24A4, SLC45A2, TYR, ASIP, and IRF4 all contribute measurable influence, affecting everything from the overall shade to how light scatters within the iris itself, which is part of what produces that shifting, color-changing quality hazel eyes are known for. This is what geneticists mean when they describe a trait as polygenic, not one gene flipping one switch, but an entire network of genes interacting, partially overriding each other, and producing outcomes that don't reduce cleanly to a simple inheritance chart. That complexity is precisely why the prediction accuracy for hazel eyes lags so far behind brown or blue. When a forensic geneticist runs a DNA sample through one of the standard eye color prediction panels used in research and law enforcement, the results for clearly brown or clearly blue eyes come back with real confidence. But intermediate colors, hazel chief among them, sit in a genetic gray zone where the same combination of gene variants can produce noticeably different outcomes in different people, shaped by factors researchers haven't fully mapped yet. Multiple independent studies across different populations, from Central Asia to the Middle East to Europe, have converged on roughly the same pattern. Strong accuracy for brown and blue, a meaningful drop for hazel and other intermediate shades. It isn't a flaw in the testing methodology. It's a reflection of something genuinely more complicated happening in the underlying biology. So where did this complicated intermediate eye color actually come from? To answer that, you need to go back roughly 300,000 years to the earliest populations of Homo sapiens in Africa. Every early human had brown eyes. There was no alternative available yet, and there was also no advantage to one. High melanin concentration in the iris, just like high melanin in the skin, offered protection against the intense ultraviolet radiation of an equatorial environment. Brown wasn't simply the most common color. It was, for the overwhelming majority of human history, the only color that existed. Blue eyes came later, and the story of exactly when has shifted as the science has improved. Early genetic estimates in the late 2000s placed the emergence of the blue-eyed mutation somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Subsequent research pushed that timeline back considerably, with some researchers proposing the underlying mutation could be tens of thousands of years old. What's been directly confirmed through ancient DNA, rather than estimated backward from modern populations, is genuinely striking. Genetic analysis of skeletal remains from sites in the Caucasus and Italy, dated to between roughly 13 and 14,000 years ago, has identified the same HERC2 region variant linked to blue eyes today. Separately, a well-known 2014 study of a roughly 7,000-year-old hunter-gatherer skeleton discovered in Spain revealed something that upended assumptions researchers had held for years. This individual, part of what geneticists call the Western hunter-gatherer population, carried the genetic markers for blue eyes. Combined with the genetic markers for notably dark skin, a combination that doesn't match the pale-skinned, blue-eyed stereotype many people associate with ancient Europeans. What's confirmed is that blue eyes were already established across parts of Europe among hunter-gatherer populations well before farming and agriculture ever arrived on the continent. That single detail is the hinge the rest of this story turns on. Because starting roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, a very different population began moving into Europe from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, bringing farming, permanent settlements, and a genetic profile that, broadly speaking, carried significantly higher rates of brown-eyed ancestry. When these incoming farming populations encountered the existing hunter-gatherer populations already living across the continent, they didn't simply replace them. Genetic evidence from numerous ancient DNA studies shows sustained mixing between the two groups across many generations, and it's at exactly that genetic intersection, blue-eyed hunter-gatherer ancestry meeting brown-eyed farming ancestry, that intermediate eye colors, hazel among them, first became genetically possible on any meaningful scale. Not a single mutation appearing in a single person, a population-level consequence of two previously separate human lineages combining their DNA. That mixing happened broadly across Europe, wherever hunter-gatherers and incoming farmers crossed paths. So why did one particular corner of the continent end up with such a strikingly disproportionate concentration of hazel eyes today? The answer requires looking specifically at what happened on the Iberian Peninsula over the following several thousand years. and it turns out to be a genuinely remarkable case study in how geography shapes genetics. Iberia sits in an unusual position. It's a peninsula, bordered by the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, separated from North Africa by a strait narrow enough to see across on a clear day, and it functioned, according to research on the region's deep genetic history, as something of an Ice Age refuge, a comparatively warm pocket where populations could persist even as much of the rest of Europe became inhospitable. That meant Iberia was already home to genetically distinct hunter-gatherer populations before farming ever arrived. Landmark research published in Science in 2019, analyzing ancient DNA from 271 individuals spanning roughly the last 8,000 years of Iberian history, alongside a companion study in current biology covering the preceding hunter-gatherer and early farming period, reconstructed this layered history in remarkable detail. The picture that emerges isn't one population being cleanly replaced by another, it's wave after wave of new ancestry arriving and mixing into what was already there. The first major shift came with the arrival of Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, layering brown-eyed ancestry over the existing hunter-gatherer population beginning around 5,500 BCE. Then came what researchers describe as the most dramatic genetic transformation the peninsula had experienced up to that point. Between roughly 2200 and 900 BCE, during the Bronze Age, populations carrying what's called steppe ancestry, originating from the Pontic-Caspian region far to the east, moved into Iberia in numbers substantial enough to replace approximately 40% of the existing genetic ancestry, and remarkably, nearly all of the peninsula's Y chromosome lineages, meaning the genetic markers passed exclusively through the male line. Researchers studying this transition have noted the pattern strongly suggests this migration was heavily male-biased, a detail that shows up clearly in how completely the paternal genetic record was overwritten while maternal lineages remained comparatively more mixed. This steppe-associated ancestry carried with it a further concentration of lighter-eyed genetic variants, adding another layer onto the blue-eyed contribution already present from the original hunter-gatherer populations. Then, centuries later, came the period historians call Al-Andalus, nearly 800 years of Muslim rule across substantial portions of the Iberian Peninsula, beginning in 711 and continuing until 1492. This wasn't a brief military campaign followed by withdrawal. It represented one of the longest periods of sustained population contact and gene flow in the peninsula's entire history, bringing substantial North African ancestry deep into a population that, by this point, already carried complex layers of hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe genetic contributions. According to the genetic research, southern Iberia in particular absorbed this ancestry extensively, creating precisely the kind of blue meets brown admixture environment that produces hazel eyes at elevated frequency. Genetic contact between Iberia and North Africa is documented as early as roughly 2500 BCE in the archaeological and genetic record. But researchers note the ancestry only became widespread across the population within roughly the last 2,000 years, with the Al-Andalus period representing its most concentrated and sustained expansion. The genetic fingerprints of every one of these waves are still directly readable in the DNA of modern Spaniards and Portuguese people today. On the paternal side, the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b dominates, found in roughly 60 to 70% of Iberian men, with a specific subclade especially concentrated across the peninsula, the direct genetic echo of that Bronze Age steppe migration that so thoroughly reshaped the region's male lineages. Alongside it, haplogroup E1b1b, associated with North African ancestry, appears in a meaningful minority of Iberian men today, alongside haplogroup J, linked to Phoenician, Punic, Roman era, and broader Levantine contact. On the maternal side, passed down through mitochondrial DNA, haplogroup H dominates, reflecting deep Mesolithic and Neolithic European roots alongside U5, tracing back to the original hunter-gatherer populations, and U6, which connects directly to North African Berber ancestry. Every one of those lineages represents a distinct historical wave of human movement, and every one of them contributed, in some measure, to the genetic conditions that make hazel eyes so disproportionately common across the peninsula today. There's likely an environmental dimension reinforcing all of this too, though it's important to be clear this remains a more provisional area of research than the ancient DNA findings themselves. Some researchers have proposed that intermediate pigmentation levels may carry a modest adaptive advantage in temperate zones, environments that are neither intensely sunny enough to strongly favor high melanin dark eyes, nor dim and overcast enough to favor the lowest melanin light eyes. Iberia's climate, sitting in exactly that kind of temperate middle ground rather than at either extreme, may have reinforced the genetic conditions already being generated by successive waves of population mixing, though this remains a contributing hypothesis rather than a definitively proven mechanism. And researchers continue investigating how much of the concentration is attributable to admixture alone versus additional selective pressure. Now here's where the science becomes genuinely humbling rather than simply interesting. All of this historical reconstruction, the ancient DNA, the migration waves, the haplogroup mapping, tells us convincingly where hazel eyes came from and why they concentrated so heavily in places like Iberia. It does not fully explain how to predict, in any individual person, whether a given combination of inherited gene variants will actually produce hazel eyes rather than light brown or green or some shade that different observers might categorize differently depending on lighting and personal perception. That prediction gap, consistently landing somewhere between 50 and 80% accuracy across multiple independent studies, isn't a temporary limitation waiting for slightly better technology. It reflects something structurally different about how this particular trait is built. Brown versus blue largely comes down to how active one regulatory switch happens to be. Hazel emerges from an entire network of genes simultaneously nudging melanin production, light scattering, and pigment distribution in directions that interact with each other in ways researchers are still actively working to fully characterize. That unresolved complexity is also, unavoidably, why hazel eyes have carried a certain mystique across human cultures for thousands of years, long before anyone understood a single gene involved. The color-shifting quality itself, appearing more green in one light and more golden or amber in another, isn't an illusion or wishful perception. It's the direct visible consequence of uneven melanin distribution within the iris interacting with light scattering exactly the way researchers have described, a genuinely unstable, responsive quality that most other eye colors simply don't exhibit to nearly the same degree. Ancient observers across multiple, unconnected cultures noticed that instability and built meaning around it, long before there was any vocabulary for melanin or chromosome 15. The mechanism is now considerably better understood. The underlying visual effect it produces hasn't become any less striking for having been explained. What all of this ultimately adds up to is something more significant than a simple fact about pigmentation. Every person alive today with hazel eyes is, in a very literal genetic sense, carrying a physical record of population movements that occurred thousands of years apart from each other. The blue-eyed hunter-gatherers who occupied Europe for millennia before agriculture ever arrived. The brown-eyed farmers who migrated in from Anatolia and gradually mixed rather than replaced. The steppe populations whose Bronze Age migration reshaped an entire continent's paternal lineage within a few centuries. The North African populations whose contact with Iberia stretched across nearly 800 years of sustained coexistence. None of those historical populations were trying to produce hazel eyes. They were living ordinary lives, moving for reasons of survival, trade, conquest, or simple curiosity about what lay beyond the next valley or across the next strait of water. The eye color that resulted is, in effect, an accidental byproduct of an extraordinarily long and complicated human story, one that happens to be legible today in roughly 1 in every 15 to 20 people you'll meet, concentrated most heavily in the exact regions where that layered history ran deepest. So what's actually confirmed and what remains genuinely open? It's confirmed through direct ancient DNA analysis rather than modern inference alone that blue-eyed genetic variants existed in European hunter-gatherer populations well before farming arrived, and that brown-eyed farming populations from Anatolia subsequently mixed with those existing populations across the continent. It's confirmed through detailed ancient genomic studies of 271 individuals spanning 8,000 years that Iberia specifically absorbed multiple additional waves of ancestry, steppe migration during the Bronze Age, and sustained North African contact during the medieval Al-Andalus period, chief among them, that layered directly on top of that original hunter-gatherer and farmer mixture. It's confirmed across numerous independent genetic studies that current DNA testing predicts brown and blue eyes with roughly 90 to 95% reliability, while hazel and other intermediate shades remain considerably harder to predict, typically somewhere between 50 and 80% depending on the specific population and testing panel used. What remains genuinely unresolved is the complete map of exactly how the full network of contributing genes, beyond the well-established roles of OCA2 and HERC2, interact with each other to produce that intermediate, shifting result, and precisely how much of hazel's regional concentration in places like Iberia comes down to admixture history alone versus any additional environmental or selective pressure still being actively researched. The next time you notice a hazel eye shift from green toward gold under changing light, what you're actually looking at isn't a trick of biology for its own sake. It's a visible physical trace of thousands of years of human beings moving, meeting, and mixing across a continent, still legible today in a trait that modern genetics, for all its power, still can't fully predict. Do you have hazel eyes? And if so, have you noticed them actually shift color depending on light or mood? Tell me in the comments, and if this one surprised you, go ahead and like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next.